Northern Affairs. We are pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, June 5th, 2024. The committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-61, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nation lands. And do also, again, want to recognize that we are having this meeting today on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I think that's very, very relevant today because we're very fortunate to have some excellent witnesses to provide testimony for this work. So I do want to welcome our witnesses to our panel. Linda DeBasage from the Anishinaabe Nation, the Grand Council Chief. From the Chiefs of Ontario, we have Grand Chief Abram Benedict and Irving LeBlanc. From the Cowessess First Nation, we have Chief Erica Baudin. And from the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, we have Deputy Grand Chief Anna Betty Achni Pinashkam, Michael McKay, the Director of Housing and Infrastructure, Jamie Saunders, who I believe is connecting virtually, and Mahegan Armstrong, Legal Counsel. So to start, we will have a round of introductions of 5 minutes for each of the four organizations here, starting with Linda DeBasage. I'll hand the floor over to you for 5 minutes.
This is for my notes. You said, sorry, Chair, this is my first time at committee. So when you say introductions, is that an introduction about me or my statement?
Pardon me, I should have been more clear. There's 5 minutes for you to provide introductory remarks, and you may use that 5 minutes as you see fit. And I'll just turn it over to the floor to you to do that.
Thank you. Ani Bojo, good afternoon. My name is Linda DeBasage, and I am the Ground Council Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territories of the Algonquin people. I'm honored to be here today to speak to the urgency and importance of safe water and wastewater legislation for First Nations across Canada. I was born and raised in Chuging First Nation in Lake Huron and was elected to my council in 2013. I was chief in my community from 2015 to 2023, and in 2024 I was elected as Grand Council Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation. The Anishinaabe Nation represents 39 First Nations in Ontario. The Anishinaabe Nation communities have always maintained their inherent right to water since time immemorial, including their right to clean, safe drinking water. Our communities continue to maintain that their ancestors have never ceded the water to any settler nation and maintain that they are stewards of the Great Lakes. I would like to begin by reminding each of you the importance and urgency for the legislation to address long-standing water and wastewater issues in First Nations community across this country. I would like to point out to this committee that the statement under Section 30 with the heading of Obligations of Government of Canada to make best efforts to provide is unacceptable and is very weak and should be replaced with will provide. The make best efforts speaks to colonial commentaries of the past. We have heard this time and again in many of the failed promises of the past, and it is time that you do better. Here in Ontario and the nations I represent, we continue to fight every day for basic human rights, including that to safe, clean drinking water. Our fight should be your fight, as we are in this together as treaty partners, and the failure to deliver this right to safe drinking water in this day and age is simply disgraceful. I think especially when our ancestors, who at one time could drink the water freely and without having fear for one's life. I am here to remind each of you of the responsibility we have collectively to First Nations people, our children, our elders, and those yet unborn. This legislation is important, it is urgent, and we cannot wait any longer. As you all know, since the enactment of the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act in 2013, we consistently asked Canada to repeal the legislation. This act was brought into force without any consultation, no funding commitment to implement, and without any engagement with First Nations regarding our inherent and treaty rights and jurisdiction to make laws on water. The act was heavily criticized for lack of meaningful engagement and consultation with First Nations, inadequate resources to implement the regulations, and increased liability to First Nations. Since that time, and in 2018, First Nations, together with their organizations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, have advocated for strong legislation that protects First Nations rights and honors our relationship with water. We've advocated for more robust protections and for the right to be recognized as stewards and decision makers. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Chief Monias from Niskandaga First Nation, Chief Spence from Tataquais Cree First Nation, and Chief Emerita Weetung from Curve Lake First Nation for their tireless efforts to bring the class action forward that ultimately compelled Canada to repeal the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act 2013. Since the repeal of the Act in June 2022, drafting of the replacement legislation was guided by a working group tasked with a process for new legislation. I was honored to be part of and co-lead that team with former National Chief Phil Fontaine. Although no process is perfect, the work between the Assembly of First Nations and ISC laid a foundation for a more inclusive process. In this process, with representatives from ISC, AFN, we worked to advance legislation. Although this was not true co-development through our worldview lens, it was an opportunity to continue to advocate for our First Nations that can make positive impacts at home and for our people. This legislation is important. It's passing a critical step towards addressing decades of harm towards First Nations that have been rooted in colonialism. I believe that with a few key changes, this legislation will allow First Nations to finally have a guaranteed chance to access clean, safe drinking water and wastewater treatment. Canada's obligation needs to go further, as I have previously mentioned. The legislation affirms that the inherent right to self-government, recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, includes the jurisdiction of First Nations in relation to water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on, in, and under First Nation lands. It acknowledges our relationship with water, and it recognizes that we have the right and jurisdiction to make our own decisions and laws about our water in relation to water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure. It allows for the creation of standards and regulations. This is so important. As of right now, First Nation do not have enforceable regulations in place. It allows for the creation of a funding framework in an urgent manner, moving away from decades of formula-based funding towards a funding mechanism that recognizes the actual costs of building, maintaining, and managing drinking water and wastewater systems. It also allows for the creation of a First Nations Water Commission, something that we have been discussing for many years. These are all critical components and cannot be overlooked as important elements of this legislation. I believe the legislation can be strengthened in a few areas that will ensure that First Nations are protected. Stronger language can help protect First Nations no matter what political party is in power. I believe that this legislation must be bipartisan, and we cannot use First Nations and this bill as a pawn in a political fight. First Nations today and the future now look to you to do the right thing and make the right recommendations to ensure this legislation has the support to ensure that the rights provided in rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, UN Resolution 292, recognition of the human right to water and sanitation are included. The creation of protection zones must recognize First Nation inherent rights as well as their jurisdiction within their respective territories. I am recommending a rights-based approach to ensure our rights and unsurrendered interests are protected. Every element of the legislation should have a time limit imposed in order to ensure that we don't continue to drag this matter on for another decade or more. Enacting Bill C-61 will mark a critical step towards securing the right to clean and safe drinking water, wastewater management for First Nations, recognizing it as both a human right and an essential service. Bill C-61 is an important milestone in a decades-long fight for adequate water and wastewater in First Nations across this country. This is an opportunity for Canada to finally do right by First Nations. The consistent failure of the Crown to resolve inherent rights over time has compounded the complexities in relation to water. However, you have an opportunity to be closer to the right and just side of society today. By addressing First Nations concerns, Bill C-61 can pave the way for a future where First Nations children grow up without water advisories and where their nations can thrive. I cannot stress enough the passage of this legislation is important, timely, and critical to protecting First Nations' health and the well-being of our people, our elders, our children, our grandchildren, and those yet unborn. We cannot afford to wait any longer. Thank you, Miigwech.
Very much, Grand Council Chief. Next, I will turn the floor over to Chief Erica Baudin to deliver 5 minutes of introductory remarks.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for asking me to witness today. My name is Erica Baudin. I am Chief of the Cowsas First Nation. We are the largest First Nation in Treaty 4 territory with 4,700 members or citizens. Before I came to Ottawa, I guess, and I say Ottawa, but I acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of the Algonquin people. I put down medicines in our waters, and while I prayed in order for all of us to have open minds, hearts, and spirits as we look at the possibilities of the inaction of Bill C-61. Water is alive. Water is life. None of us, not one of us, whether we are Indigenous or not, can exist without clean drinking water. The social determinants of health also are very important to consider when we look at aspects such as providing safer communities for our children. There are several bills that are before Parliament right now, and to think that Bill C-61 sits in unison and isn't connected to other bills would not look at the interconnectedness of what it takes for our nations, our communities, to deliver proper living conditions for our people. Bill C-61, the First Nations Clean Water Act, represents a significant step forward in affirming the rights of First Nations communities to self-governance over water resources on our lands. It is a positive development in recognizing that First Nations have the inherent right to manage our water, our own water, source water, drinking water, and wastewater infrastructure. This legislative framework seeks to ensure that First Nations have access to clean and safe drinking water, a long overdue commitment given the historical neglect and challenges faced by many Indigenous communities in Canada. The bill outlines several promising aspects, such as the creation of rights-based regulatory pathways in collaboration with First Nations, other federal ministers, and provincial governments. These pathways are designed to protect water sources adjacent to First Nations lands and protect a legal structure for First Nations to exercise control over water resources on our territories. This is an important recognition of self-determination and aligns with the principles set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. While the Act is a step in the right direction, there are limitations that must be acknowledged. Funding is always a primary concern with anything related to First Nations, and we need certainly to ensure this legislation has long-term impact and enables predictability of resources to address the deep-rooted issues surrounding water quality and infrastructure. While the legislation speaks to best efforts to provide adequate and sustainable funding for water services, I believe we could strengthen that language to further strengthen the bill. The other point I'd like to briefly touch on is the requirement for First Nations to collaborate with provincial governments on protecting source water, which would present challenges. I can only speak from my experience as a chief from Saskatchewan, but I have seen firsthand, not only seen, but currently am experiencing firsthand on behalf of our nation in our fight for the sovereignty and the jurisdiction over our traditional lands and waterways. I have seen firsthand the jurisdictional conflicts, unhelpful provincial actions, and lack of rights recognition which complicate efforts to safeguard water quality on First Nations lands. I understand that there is a federal need for intergovernmental cooperation, but I would be remiss if I did not flag how that may hinder the timely implementation of protections that are crucial for ensuring safe drinking water for our communities. The criticism from some Indigenous groups that the bill's best efforts clause is insufficient cannot be overlooked. The lack of a binding legal commitment to provide safe and clean drinking water, coupled with the absence of a clear mechanism for enforcement, means that the bill may not fully address systemic issues it aims to solve. Bill C-61 is a necessary and positive step towards recognizing First Nations rights to self-governance and ensuring clean water access. But like any legislation, it can become stronger with amendments. I believe with clearer tools such as a commitment to predictable funding, coupled with mechanisms to support First Nations in dealing with unaligned provincial governments, this legislation will protect water for all our generations yet to come. The time is now for Bill C-61 to come into force. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief Baudin. Next up, I will turn the floor over to Anishinaabe ASCII, I believe Deputy Grand Chief Anna Betty Ashcombe to provide 5 minutes of opening remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. Bache, bonjour. My name is Anna Betty Ashcombe, and I serve as the Deputy Grand Chief for Anishinaabe ASCII Nation. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting us to make a presentation to the committee on its study of Bill C-61, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and infrastructure on First Nations. I also want to acknowledge that this committee meeting is taking place in Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence there reached back in time immemorial. Anishinaabe ASCII Nation is composed of 49 First Nation communities, most of which are signatories to Treaty Number 9 in the Ontario portion of Treaty Number 5. Treaty Number 9 is unique amongst the historical treaties because it was an agreement signed by First Nations with Canada and Ontario. We also state that the people of Anishinaabe ASCII Nation are a sovereign people with sovereign and inherent rights by virtue of being the first peoples of their lands. As of September 23rd, which is today, 2024, there are 13 long-term drinking water advisories within 12 of Anishinaabe ASCII Nation communities, including my home community of Martin Falls. There are 9 drinking water advisories that have been in place for less than a year. 9 communities have difficulty accepting that treated water is safe to drink, even once drinking water advisories have been lifted. And we have to ask ourselves why. And a lot of that is because of the trauma that is associated and the health impacts of the lack of safe water. INAN has submitted a briefing to the advisory committee, the text of which is available on the Indigenous and Northern Affairs website. INAN chiefs have not endorsed a formal position on Bill C-61, but believe that several amendments could be made to strengthen the wording in Bill C-61. The amendments recommended by Anishinaabe ASCII Nation include: ensure that Bill C-61 is binding on the Crown, ensuring that Bill C-61 is worded so that the First Nation laws also have the force of federal laws, ensure that adequate long-term funding provisions are provided in Bill C-61. Bill C-61 does not provide a clear framework for the government of source water protection protection zones, leaving it ambiguous who has ultimate authority over the establishment, management, and enforcement of these zones. For the remaining time I have, I would like to ask our legal counsel, Megan Armstrong, to speak a bit more on the suggested changes to Bill C-61 that is outlined in the brief submitted by Anishinaabe Nation.
Hello, I'm Megan Armstrong. I'm a lawyer representing Anishinaabe Nation. I'm going to very quickly go through some of the amendments and the rationale behind that. So in the briefing note, we make two pretty big suggestions that are making sure that the lawmaking sections where it talks about jurisdiction are binding on the Crown, just the federal Crown, and making sure that First Nation laws have the force of law as federal law. These are both kind of used in tandem to make sure that the lawmaking sections of the Bill C-61 are strengthened and there's a bit more certainty. And the reason why we're suggesting these is in light of a new Supreme Court of Canada case that came out in February. It was the reference case on the Act Respecting the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families Act. That came out. The decision was rendered February 9th. That was after this bill came into the House of Commons. So we incorporated some of that guidance from the Supreme Court of Canada case, and we want to strengthen some parts of this bill with that guidance from the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just for the awareness of committee members, we will have Grand Chief Abram Benedict joining in a short while, and we'll give an opportunity for him to be able to provide opening remarks at that point. But this concludes the introductory remarks section, and we will move into our first round of questioning, which is the 6-minute round. And starting with from the Conservative Party, Mr. Schmill, you have, Mr. Melillo, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You tried to give my speaking time away. I appreciate it. And thank you to all the witnesses for being here to speak to this important piece of legislation. Very much appreciate it. I will start with Anishinaabe Nation with the Deputy Grand Chief. When the bill was introduced, Grand Chief Fiddler said in a press release, and this is a quote, "We acknowledge that some First Nations have had opportunities for input into drafting of this legislation, but we do not agree that this legislation has been co-drafted." Can you describe the process that NAN has had in the development of this legislation and why that conclusion was made?
Thank you, Member of Parliament Merlo, for that question. I do have a copy of that statement that was presented by Grand Chief Fiddler at that time. I'm going to turn it over to our legal counsel to respond to that. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah. Can you rephrase that question, please?
The question is just about the involvement that NAN had in the lead up to this. The statement indicated from Grand Chief Fiddler that although there are opportunities for input into the drafting, that Anishinaabe Nation does not agree that the legislation has been co-drafted. So I'm just curious into what that process was like in terms of the involvement of NAN.
Yeah, for sure. So the drafting process took place over about a year, and sort of what ended up happening at that time was there was, my understanding, an NDA with some of the parties that were doing the drafting. INAN wasn't a part of that. So that would reflect probably at that point in time that there was periods of time where there was no input other than the parties that were party to that NDA that were doing the drafting.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I'll ask Grand Council Chief Linda here as well in the room. I believe you said in your opening remarks that that this was not true co-development, if I heard you correctly. Would you like to expand on that, and did you have a similar view as Anishinaabe Nation did?
Miigwech for the question. And I want to respond in the most kindest of ways. You are an MP in the House of Commons. There are certain, I would say, legislative privileges that comes with that role, and really to any party that is in power at the time. I believe that through the process instituted by Canada and that of the Parliament, cabinet privilege is one of them. And so my understanding of cabinet privilege is there are conversations that happen, mandates are given, and that is in absolute isolation of any First Nation person, community across this country. And so when I look through the lens, our worldview lens of co-development, it requires an understanding, a collective goal, and working towards that goal without any hindrance. Obviously, I also shared in my statements around, the lack of access to clean, safe drinking water is a symptom of colonialism that started, hundreds of years ago, and through those processes. So I feel that in this particular process, the AFN Chiefs in Assembly did provide a resolution and mandate to move forward with a process with Canada to develop replacement legislation as ordered by the court. And part of that process, my experience, firstly as a councillor in my community, was heavy engagements with the Chiefs of Ontario at the time that fed in to the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations, continued advocacy and pushes, so resolutions developed over time. As a chief, I participated in many engagement sessions surrounding the safe drinking water legislation across the province of Ontario, and what we created at the AFN through those development processes since 2018 were 29 preliminary concepts that were provided to Canada. And so to kind of give you some context to my response in terms of co-development, it's what lens do you look through, and what is mandated through cabinet privilege.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'd just like very quickly to ask one more question, if I could, Chair, and I'll come back to Anishinaabe Nation. And it was mentioned in opening remarks by a few folks here, some of the wording in this legislation that the Minister must consult and cooperate before moving forward with regulations. Do you have a view on that type of legislation, if it's strong enough, or if it should be amended going forward?
It would have to be a very brief answer.
And this is directed to Anishinaabe Nation?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Megan or Jamie, are you able to respond to that?
I can respond to that. So you're talking about consult and cooperate. That's throughout multiple provisions in that, right?
That's correct, yes.
So I would say from a legal standpoint, It does require consultation, and it does require cooperation, which might be undefined from a legal standpoint. In my view, I would say it kind of remains to be seen how that is implemented, which I think kind of speaks largely to the entire legislation, which is, I think implementation is going to be one of the bigger pieces, and see how that kind of rolls out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo, and we will be going on to our next questioner here, which will be Mr. Or no, sorry, will be Mr. Sorry. Oh yes. So it's our great pleasure to welcome our last witness joining us today. We have Grand Chief Abram Benedict, who from the Ontario Regional Chief. And sorry to put you immediately on the spot here, but well, I'd like to give you the opportunity to provide 5 minutes of opening remarks.
Sure, absolutely. My apologies, members of the committee, for being a few minutes late. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon or this evening. I'm Abram Benedict. I'm the Ontario Regional Chief for the Chiefs of Ontario, which is an organization here in Ontario that represents 133 First Nations. Prior to being the Ontario Regional Chief, I was the chief of the Mohawk community of Akwesasne for 9 years, and was a member of the 9 years of the council there as well, so 18 years in community leadership. I've had the privilege and honor of being elected the regional chief for the communities in Ontario. And so the important issue that you're speaking about today is about the legislation around clean drinking water. And unfortunately, 72% of the boil water advisories that exist in this nation, 72% of them are in Ontario. And so we are the most impacted region by the historic failure to provide clean drinking water to our communities. These persistent issues not only jeopardize the health and well-being of our people, but undermine the right of our self-determination, our governance, and the future of our communities. And as you can imagine, water is a fundamental to existence and also to prosperity to many of our nations across Turtle Island, but more so specifically the ones that have boil water advisories in Ontario. There are entire generations that have been unable to see clean drinking water from their taps. And I recently had an opportunity to be in Escandaga, which is one of the communities that has had a boil water advisory for 30 years. And so when you put that in context, there's been children that have been born, raised, and now are adults and still have had to live with boil water advisories. And so in today's context, that is extremely chilling and unacceptable. I'm here to deliver a message, a simple message today, that Bill C-61 is not perfect, but we do support it and must see fruition and pass. This bill is a step forward in recognizing the First Nations' inherent and treaty rights that exist. It unambiguously states that the water in and under First Nation land is First Nation jurisdiction, which is extremely important to our people. It recognizes the essential role of women, elders, and knowledge keepers as water protectors and stewards of our water. And we have seen time and time again, as our people have taken to do either marches or water walks across this beautiful land in which we co-inhabit, for the rights and the recognition of the importance of water. Since the tragedy at Walkerton, the rest of Ontario has had high drinking water standards. First Nations have unfortunately been left behind. This legislation does fill an important gap for us to be able to create binding regulations and standards for clean drinking water. While we support this legislation, we believe it must be strengthened in 4 critical areas. Predicated and sustainable funding is extremely important. The creation of a protection zone and addressing urgent water and sanitization issues for Ontario First Nations, and addressing the real liability issues that exist. Our recommendations are to ensure that this bill can achieve its intended impact. So funding must be provided at sustainable levels to ensure to address the historical challenges of underfunding and that have created so many challenges in our communities. This includes not only initial capital investments, but also long-term operation and maintenance supports to ensure the viability of the water systems in our communities. Chronic underfunding has historically plagued water infrastructure in First Nation communities. Temporary or project-based funding is not sufficient to ensure the ongoing maintenance of water systems in our communities. Beyond infrastructure, there is a need for funding that supports capacity building within First Nation communities. This includes training local water operators, developing governance structures for water management, and ensuring communities have the knowledge, resources to manage their water systems effectively. This is true nation building, and this legislation will promote and bring that forward. Canada has recently settled a class action lawsuit in which it recognizes the urgent need for more funding. However, there have not been new investments to date, and this must be fixed. We believe that protection zones, as currently outlined in this bill, lack clarity, and what is meant by is adjacent to the First Nations lands of a First Nation. Let's resolve this ambiguity using rights-based approach. The absence of defined limits and protection could lead to conflicts between federal, provincial, and First Nation jurisdiction. There are so many areas that we have seen this conflict happen between the federal government, the provincial governments, and our communities. This is an opportunity to clarify that. C-61 must clearly define protection zones to strengthen First Nation self-determination, which in our view includes recognition of the importance of First Nation knowledge systems in establishing and managing protection zones. And that is, our people have been protecting the resources that is extremely important to everybody sitting in this room since time immemorial. And we need this legislation to be able to continue to support that. Many First Nations face issues related to source water and groundwater qualities. Algae bloom, industry spills, and might not be fully predictable, but we can guarantee that they will happen, and they will happen again. We need rapid response funding and technical assistance to address urgent water issues in our communities in this region. We need flexibility in funding and regulatory approaches to accommodate urgent issues. The final issue is around the uncertainty of liability for our communities, particularly in cases where they may lack the resources or capacity to manage water systems independently. We urge the committee to amend Bill C-61 to clearly define and fairly allocate the liability. We must ensure that the liability is fair and reasonable on our communities and shared with the federal government. The legislation should explicitly protect First Nations from liability for historic contamination and infrastructure failures that occurred before the implementation of Bill C-61. First Nations should not be held liable for Canada's historic failure to properly fund infrastructure, maintenance, operation, and training, nor should First Nations be held accountable for future failures in undermining the government. Bill C-61 should explicitly state the liability of third-party contractors involved in building or maintaining water infrastructure, ensuring that First Nations are not held liability for contractors' error and negligence. I want to clearly highlight that our communities will reasonably accept the liability, but will not take on broken systems and systems that are underfunded and then be expected to be held liable for the federal government's lack of action on their end. We do not want a scenario where First Nations energies and limits fundings go to lawsuits instead of maintaining the integrity of water systems. We do not want to be in the courts any more than any person in this room. So let's make those differences now in this legislation and ensure that we don't have to use those avenues. We urge the committee to consider these recommendations. Chiefs of Ontario and myself would be pleased to answer any questions and follow up and provide any additional information this committee would like. Yamagoa.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief. With that, we'll move back into our first round of questioning. Mr. Batiste, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll start with Chief Bowden, because we just saw each other in the Treaty 4 territory for the 150th anniversary celebration of Treaty 4, and one of the most magnificent celebrations I have ever seen, with all of the headdresses up front. Was just an amazingly powerful statement, but also such beautiful beadwork on all of them. It was very amazing. You had talked a little bit about the province, the trouble with collaboration with the provinces that is implied in this legislation. I'm wondering if you think that formal recognition of a First Nations inherent right over water would strengthen your position when dealing with provinces if recognized in this legislation.
Thank you for the question. And also thank you for the recognition of the 150 years of the signing of Treaty 4. It absolutely would. Short answer is it absolutely would. Our experience right now is with the dam restructuring project. And it is the dam restructuring project, it is time to build a new dam. Now, when we talk about jurisdiction, when we're also talking about legal protections to assist First Nations, which is hopeful in this bill, this will give us more leverage in order to have in our toolbox the ability to I don't want to say fight, to have the fight, but to assert that jurisdiction that we never gave up. So we have the inherent as well as the treaty rights to all of our traditional waters as well as our waterways and our shorelines. And currently we are in a deadlocked position with the province of Saskatchewan, where if we do not agree to sell our traditional lands to the province so that they could rebuild our dam structure, that in fact they will not build the dam that is essential. And so we are now in a position where we are contemplating court action. And that court action is very expensive. And as well, for Kausas, we are strong, we are proud. However, the monies that we have from own source revenue should be going to the people. They should not be fighting what is already inherently ours. And so our hope is with Bill C-61 that this will give us another tool for us so that we could perhaps so that we wouldn't have to go into that type of a legal fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Red or white is on. These are the new ones. Okay. Regional Chief, I'm going to come to you with a question. You had stated earlier that 72% of the boil water advisories are coming from Ontario. Do you think that a regional approach, because I know a lot of different, being from a First Nations reserve myself of about 5,000 people, we have different capacity levels for being able to deal with the oversight and operations and maintenance of water. It's a very technical thing. You talked about it in your speeches. Do you think it's something that would be willing to, that we should be thinking about as a national First Nations-led water authority that would come to would help with better outcomes, especially around operating and maintaining the maintenance of water? And in asking you this, because I know there's different levels of trust in government, do you think it would be a better to do this as nations, as First Nations or regional based in Ontario? How do you think that could work if possible?
Well, a couple of things on that. I think that in some cases, regional approaches work, but in the case of clean drinking water, I mean, it's pretty technical on the ground, right? I mean, you can have all the regional bodies you want that either work through regulations or do inspections, but the most important is that the capacity is on the ground. And so when we see regional approaches around supporting communities, it's not, it's inspection for houses or, engineering services, but I'm not sure that, a regional technical body would be able to support the operation, the technical operation of water facilities in community. Now, if there is a regulatory body that will support them, yes. I mean, but at the end of the day, the resources are needed to operate, the facilities, and the regulations in the technical aspect is one approach to it. So, I wouldn't say that it's impossible, but I think that, you really have to think about that one because what is needed is trained, qualified water operators that, have the resources to do their job. And a regional body is not necessarily going to do that for them.
I know I don't have much time left, but for the communities that don't have currently, that have boil water advisories, do you think the capacity is a problem in terms of the training that's needed to ensure clean water and the consistency with keeping that water?
Ultimately, in many cases, it's about resources to ensure that they are trained and to be able to do their job, right? And so when you have communities that are remote and fly in, we have to bring the members out of the community, train them, and support them in that aspect. And, that's a whole educational aspect and bring them back into community to do their job. And so we need adequate resources to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baptiste. Au prochain, on va aller à...
Next, we're going to go to Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you. Firstly, Chief de Basige from our Grand Council Chief. I'd like to hear you speak to protection zones, particularly under a federal act. I know that the federal government wants to remain vague in its definition of a protection zone. Right now, it's provincial jurisdiction, so it is a provincial issue, but protection zones are under the Water Resource Act. So in Ontario, we talk about protection zones. In Quebec, we talk about a protected area. But we can see that this is very similar. This is a certain area, watershed that's protected. So we're taking into account all the different characteristics of these water sources. And Ontario, with the Anishinaabe Nation in the Great Lakes region, they've been seriously impacted. So have you participated in Ontario's work to define these protected zones around your nation?
Thank you for the question. I believe that's a complex question that has a complex response and answers. Starting through the treaty-making processes, treaties were only for land, and those treaties did not contemplate land underwater or water itself. Where Canada has failed, the Crown has failed over time, even in the division of power from the federal responsibility to the provincial responsibility. Through that period of colonizations, First Nations people were not considered a people, and we're simply savages. Our First Nations people were given the authority by Creator to protect for future generations that it did not belong to us. And so when you speak to the province of Ontario, they really don't need to consult with First Nations. They will say that First Nations are that of a federal jurisdiction and the provincial jurisdiction does not prevail. The provincial laws that are created don't go far enough to recognize the treaty and inherent rights to even resources for that matter. And so the protection zones that have been described by the province of Ontario were described with no consultation or consideration of First Nations people. And it was in those spaces that the context of that legislation was created without any opportunities for us. And that again becomes that provincial jurisdictional imbalance, and both, I think, equally responsible in not recognizing the inherent rights and jurisdictions of First Nations people. Thank you.
Miigwech, qu'est-ce qui arrive?
What should we do when there is an overlap between two provinces to establish a protected zone that will be sustainable? How can we protect, for example, both sides of Kichisibi? or the Ottawa River. So how can we protect this river, for example?
Is that to any member? Oh.
Un conseil, mais effectivement, si vous voulez rajouter quelque chose.
I was continuing with the Grand Council Chief, but if anyone else wants to add something?
Sorry, I think this is about the aligning of laws, and that First Nations should have lawmaking powers, and that needs to be recognized at all levels of government. And, for far too many years, we've been left out of discussions and, even up to the 60s, not able to vote. So as we evolve as First Nations, as treaty evolves, as government evolves, I think there is a tremendous opportunity to work together to recognize the inherent rights and jurisdiction of First Nations and support that moving forward. When there is a will, there is always a way, and I think history has told us when there is a political will, things can happen. However, when it comes to First Nations people, the political will has always been to eradicate us and to assimilate us and to, exert control over us. So now is an opportunity for Canada, from a nonpartisan perspective, to come together with us. Miigwech.
Donc, c'est vraiment à travers le libellé.
So it's through the wording of this bill that you're expecting that there will be a clear definition of a protected zone, and this includes consultation with relevant First Nations groups to better protect the most important waterways for the Anishinaabe Nation. Correct?
Absolutely. That while I represent the Anishinaabe Nation as a political territorial organization, the rights belong to our people and to our nations that existed prior to treaty. And so that has to be defined by them through proper mechanisms, but also stating that this is not something that should be used to delay the opportunities for First Nation to have clean, safe drinking water and wastewater services.
Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire.
Okay.
On to the next. We're going online to Ms. Ashton. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by sharing my condolences with the family of Johnson Redhead in Shamattawa First Nation here in our region. I know many members of committee are aware of the tragic situation of a 6-year-old boy who was missing for a number of days and unfortunately has been found deceased. And I'm sure that all of our thoughts are with his family and his First Nation at this time. 1,302. That's how many days have passed since the Liberals were supposed to end every single long-term boiled water advisory in Canada. Here in northern Manitoba, in my constituency, Matthias Colomb Cree Nation has been without clean running water for more than 4 years. Shamattawa First Nation, almost 6. And we can't forget that this Prime Minister's preferred method to deal with communities that don't have clean drinking water is to fight them in court. That this piece of legislation only came about after the Liberal government lost in court a class action led by a number of First Nations, including Tatasqueyak Cree Nation here in our region, shows the extent to which he's failed to get the job done. This is not a Prime Minister or a political party that intends to live First Nations out of poverty. This is a government that will only do the right thing when it's forced to, like the $57 billion in this year's budget for First Nations. That's court-ordered money. It's shameful. I recently spoke with Chief Hill of Shamattawa First Nation and his team following his cross-examination by Canada's lawyers. For those that don't know, Shamattawa and 59 other First Nations are fighting the Liberal government over its missed deadline to deliver clean drinking water. I'd like to quote a message I received from Chief Hill. It really highlights the rank hypocrisy of the Liberals. They may say nice things on one side, but it's what they're doing in court where they hope that Canadians aren't paying attention that really matters. As Chief Hill shared with me, this litigation has been painful. Canada has decided to defend the case rather than come to the table as nation-to-nation partners. The cross-examinations were long and painful. My cross-examination took place over 3 days, and the lawyers for Canada went through the minute details of Shamattawa's finances. I was asked questions that sought to blame me and my band counsel for our long-term drinking water advisory. Rather than look in the mirror, he went on to say, Canada is pointing the finger at First Nations for the entirely predictable consequences of its own actions. This is what happens when First Nations take a stand. Canada says that it cares about reconciliation, but through this litigation, it has made clear that First Nations are just an inconvenience. Canada's decision to fight First Nations over access to clean drinking water is a national embarrassment. They are treating First Nations like we aren't even human beings. It is no wonder why our members are the sickest, die the youngest, and experience the highest suicide rates in the country. What's even more shocking is what the lawyers hired by the Liberals are saying in court, hoping no one pays attention. They argue that First Nations don't have a right to clean drinking water. They'll argue that it's First Nations themselves that are to blame for the lack of clean drinking water. My first question is to the Chiefs of Ontario. Do you feel like the government is doing enough for your First Nations? Do you agree with this government's lawyers that First Nations do not have a right to clean drinking water?
Well, thank you for the question. I would say that, it is obviously disappointing when we have to resort to the courts to see action. And while there has been, as you've outlined, the commitment to end the boil water advisories, that has not happened. And so, we have had to work with the Assembly of First Nations and support a lawsuit for bringing that to an end. So we are disappointed by the process that exists. There has been progress. Progress has been made. Boil water advisories communities have come off boil water advisories. But more progress needs to be made. And so, do we like being in the courts? Absolutely not. Do we know that there are solutions that can be found if we're sitting at the table? Yes. And have we had those conversations? Yes. Is it happening fast enough? Absolutely not. And so I described in my testimony that, 30-year boil advisory in the community is not acceptable.
Thank you for sharing that. Building on that, I want to read some of the things that Canada's lawyers are arguing when they are in court fighting First Nations access to clean drinking water. Quote, Canada does not owe any legal obligations or duties to operate and maintain, referring to First Nations water systems. Or Canada is providing extensive funding and support to First Nations to operate and maintain community water systems. That Canada is doing what it should because, quote, the great majority of First Nations have water that is safe to drink and meets the guidelines for Canadian drinking water quality. Knowing fully well, so many communities are under long-term boiled water advisories. Quote, Canada denies it has any legal obligation or duty to First Nations, end of quote, when it comes to a responsibility to provide or fund water infrastructure on reserve. Denies a legal obligation to clean drinking water to First Nations. I find those statements absolutely chilling and particularly disgusting that they are being argued by our federal government actively as they fight First Nations on the very basic issue of clean drinking water. To other witnesses on the panel, I'm wondering how you feel about these statements. Do you agree with any of them? Do you find issue with any of them?
I will be the first to respond to that. First of all, sitting here as First Nations, as the Indigenous peoples of this land, the original peoples of this land, everything that you have reported in the last 6 minutes, we have been born into. We know all of these statistics. We live it every day. In the legal system, people will say what they need to say in order to win. That is the type of legal system we have. It is not a justice system, it is a legal system. As the original peoples of this land, what we have been told through treaty, and I'm speaking from a treaty perspective, is that covenant that has been there from the newcomers or the Crown and the original peoples as well as Creator, is that we must work together. And so we acknowledge that there has been, we were born into genocidal policies. We still are subjected to them. We still bury so many children, so many people that over any other Canadian or people who live in what is now Canada. We know this because we go to the wakes and funerals. We understand the chronic underfunding. But what we do state here today, at least for myself, is that while that is going on, we have opportunity with this bill, even if the government is currently faced with having to do the right thing. Yes, we acknowledge that the court has stated that they do the right thing, but we must still work together in order to ensure that the death toll goes down, that we have the safe water drinking, that we have adequate funding, that there are legal tools in our toolbox with the provincial and the federal and the First Nations, jurisdictional fight. So thank you for the question. I don't think you need to have one without the other, or only one is the right way to go. I think that the time is now for us to act and work together in order to get this legislation passed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ashton. That completes our first round of questioning. Moving to our second round, the 5-minute round, and I believe Mr. Shields will be turning it over to you.
Thank you for witnesses being here today. I'm going to address this question and give all 4 witnesses today to answer it, please. Source water and protection zones. What's your definition that you need to see of what source water and protection zones are?
I can try. I can start that based more on a technical viewpoint. You know, you delineated what is source water and what is source water protection. You know, the approach that First Nations have looked at is more from a watershed protection area, and I think it's really points to the discussion on protection zones and what some of the witnesses have said, saying that we have jurisdiction and over the protecting the watersheds. And I think that's really the definition is really problematic, and I think everybody's pointed that out. I've listened to these committees meetings over the last several weeks, and it's been raised a question. Nobody's come up with an answer of a definition of source water, protection zones. That is going to be, I think, a major activity, major work that has to be done here, and I think it's a very important part of it, where the federal government has to come in there, and as it's been said, federal government has to come in and I know this was mentioned, to make sure provinces work collaboratively with First Nations in terms of establishing these protection zones, because water doesn't end at the boundary. Water has no boundaries. So I think it's going to be one major area that will need to be looked at. Clearly, it's not clear in the legislation. So,
I'll go to the next one. You've said that it needs to be a coordinated agreement between all 3 levels then. And you said use the watershed as a term which may be synonymous with that.
That's I think that's a very good place to start. Are you in our watershed? What's in our watershed? Who else is in our watershed? It doesn't matter whether there are boundaries within that watershed. It has to be approached, and in order to protect that for environment for everybody, those three levels of government have to work together.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Yep. Next, Grand Chief.
Well, I don't want to take too much time on this. I know that Grand Chief Dubosky wants. The only thing that I would say around source water is an experience in my community, who's a community of Akwesasne, an hour south of here, borders Ontario, New York, and Quebec. And I can tell you that an EPA project was happening in Messina, New York, and they were issuing, water advisories and don't consume the fish advisories. And so that was for a river flowing into the St. Lawrence. There was no reciprocal agreement happening with Canada. And so the problem with that is that you can't eat the American fish, but you can eat the Canadian fish because there's no mercury and PCBs in them. And so when we look at source water for the international line, there has to be a connection there as well, because contaminants can come down there, not going to stop at the international line, and those intakes will be on both sides of the international line. There needs to be collaboration that occurs for the safety of all of our people.
Thank you for clarifying that. Grand Chief?
Thank you for the question. I believe that Canada needs to recognize, again, the inherent and treaty rights of First Nations and take the lead in bringing together the orders of government, both provincial and federal. It's really about aligning laws and recognizing First Nation laws so that water is protected at its source, and that that our inherent rights holders are also equal footing at those different tables. And Irving spoke about the watershed, those kind of territorial areas, and I believe that an exercise does need to happen. I can't speak for any treaty nations on my own. I believe that we have to take the time to build that, but I do believe that it is possible, and this really is a first step. And we can argue all day long about who did what and who didn't do what. I believe, again, and I'm going to say this again because I was a bit saddened that we're trying to make this into a partisan issue. First Nations absolutely have a right to clean, safe drinking water. Our children, our babies, our elders, everybody. We've been out without that for far too long, and that's because of the colonialism. And I think, again, Canada does have an opportunity to recognize those and bring the legal order or the government partners together to have those discussions in proper spaces.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields. And I know, Mr. Saunders, you have your hand up, but we're through this round, but there will be another round for questions. But with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Hanley. You have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of the witnesses today for the really in-depth testimony. Chief Beaudin, I have a couple of questions for you, but I'm a public health physician, so I was interested when you brought up social determinants of health and how that relates to access to safe drinking water. Social determinants of health being areas like education, employment, income, also presence of historical trauma. So I wanted, perhaps you can elaborate on how access to safe drinking water, particularly as enshrined in legislation, relates to social determinants of health in general.
Thank you for the question. I don't think that you could speak about the social determinants to health without the foundation being clean drinking water. I think that every aspect of whether it comes from bathing to consumption when I'm talking about consumption, I'm not only just speaking about drinking the clean water, but we had just had a question about source water protection. We have fish. We have the birds that we eat. So fish we eat, birds we eat. We call them four-leggeds, the animals that we eat. When they do not have clean drinking water themselves, and we consume those foods, then our bodies become sick. And if we don't have complete balance in terms of physical health, in terms of having the ability to access clean drinking water, or our animals to access clean drinking water, then what that does is it leads the pathway for people to not go to school, kids to not go to school. When we talk about poverty, it's not only financial poverty, it's the poverty of education, it's the poverty to, while I guess mercury, other items that are in the drinking water, that we also don't have the access to physicians, to different types of medical needs that we have. So it's all interconnected in what we need to do, whether or not we're human or we are of, like I said, the swimmers, the ones that fly in the sky, and the four-leggeds. We're all interconnected. Water is life. And when we talk about the social determinants of health, if our animals aren't healthy, if the water is not healthy, we won't be healthy, and therefore we cannot contribute to our nation, we cannot contribute to society, or what is now Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to leave you for a minute. I may not get to come back to you, but Deputy Chief Acne Peniscum, I hope I did okay with your name. You talk about trust. I was intrigued when you said that people have difficulty drinking water after an advisory has been lifted, which speaks to the trust that citizens have either in the advice that's being provided or in the integrity of the water itself. And I wonder how you see, again, this legislation as helping to support rebuilding that trust.
Thank you for that question. So can you imagine being born and raised in a community where you've never been able to go freely to the tap and be able to drink the water? And as you're growing up in that community and being raised with that mindset, and then one day being told, okay, our water, we're able to drink it. It's, that's very troubling for us to adjust. So trust is a big issue. And I just wanted to add some comments in terms of social determinants. We've had some individuals who have very serious skin rashes. It's mostly children that have been affected. And we also have citizens who are unable to get home dialysis because of the quality of water, and where they have to go and move to an urban center in order for them to access dialysis, even the home dialysis. Something that everyone takes for granted is not taken for granted in many of our First Nation communities.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanley. Au prochain, on a Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Grand Chief Benedict, through the drafting of various bills, C-38, 53, others that were not passed, but there seems to be some through line on the part of government. From the witness side, I feel that some are a bit concerned about this bill, things that we've noticed ourselves and other political parties also have perhaps noted. And we believe officials should be in a position to tell us what a zone of protection is. What does it mean to them? Or a protected area. I don't know if this is properly defined, and I think that's a problem. It would be very useful in the context of our deliberations. So I asked the officials from the department to provide that definition. Mr. Benedict, since our first meeting on the bill, C-61, I keep thinking of organizations that were created by the government, like the Métis Nation of Ontario and the Algonquins of Ontario, because they live in Indigenous lands and they have rights in on these lands. So Bill C-53 is on ice, as we can see, but the minister was unwilling to ask that question of how to define these rights. There was an issue of the overlap of lands. There was a discussion of 12.1 and its interpretation. Should we be far clearer as to the rights of First Nations on their lands, and what are the First Nations that can speak? Who can speak to these issues in the context?
Thank you for the question. And it is clear to me that in this legislation, it only deals with First Nations people and First Nations people on reserve lands. And so Métis do not live on First Nation lands, and so the legislation in its present form, which we are supportive of in its present form, does not affect Métis nations. And so, there is some language around Section 12 around modern treaties and self-governments, but there is a policy that the department has under the inherent right policy. And so there are a number of communities that are negotiating self-government agreements that are mechanisms that, for all intents and purposes, acknowledge the jurisdiction that has always been there for communities. And so if a community wants to develop legislation around safe drinking water, that would be a vehicle under this legislation for that. And as I mentioned earlier, in my community, if it was devolved to the provinces in Akwesasne, they would be relying on Quebec legislation and Ontario legislation to govern their water. And imagine having two systems, depending on where that water treatment facility is and how you're going to do that. And having two sets of rules that your people must be trained on is not practical. And so having mechanisms in legislation that recognizes self-government agreements or modern treaties is a positive. But this is not in relation to Métis rights.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire. Next we have Ms. Ashton for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. We all know that the crisis of clean drinking water is directly related to the housing crisis on First Nations. It recently came out that on housing, that the federal government has shortchanged First Nations in the prairie provinces by a total of $250 million. The Prime Minister and his cabinet have fundamentally ruled out reimbursing First Nations in the prairie provinces from whom they stole that money. In my riding, communities like Garden Hill and Island Lake First Nations, remote First Nations, face some of the worst housing, one of the most acute housing crises in the country. And we know that for a community like Garden Hill, the lack of proper housing has meant that by the time water gets to them, it often becomes contaminated. I imagine there are similar connections in communities across your regions. The lack of climate-resistant infrastructure is also a real problem when we're talking about water treatment plants, water systems, etc. I know that this makes it clear that resolving the clean drinking water issue means resolving the housing crisis. I'd like to open it up to whoever might want to share how the lack of adequate housing and the lack of adequate infrastructure affects your community's ability to have clean drinking water.
I've been delegated to speak to this question. Can you please repeat your question succinctly, please?
Sure. How the lack of adequate housing and the lack of adequate infrastructure is connected to the crisis of clean drinking water.
I don't believe C-61 speaks to the solution of the housing crises, the infrastructure crises. I'm actually a trained civil engineering technologist, educated and experienced in that. And although there are, I would say, connections to the drinking water crisis, I believe all three need their own respective legislation. So today we're talking about clean, safe drinking water. There have been reports that have been provided to the Government of Canada, and MPs have access to this in relation to closing the gap that was commissioned by the Assembly of First Nations. There's also a housing and homelessness report. There was also Senate committee reports back in the, I think, mid-2000s that, start to talk about how all of these are interrelated and what needs to be done. And at this point in time, we're studying C61, which is, a step in the right direction. C61 will not solve the housing crisis. C61 will not solve the infrastructure aspect as well. And we shouldn't put them all together either. They all have their own individual streams. But certainly, when it comes to clean, safe drinking water, we can't go very long. Not one of us, no matter what skin color we have and know what political party represent, we can't live without water. The social determinants of health question, when communities don't have access to clean, safe drinking water, what else are they drinking? Pop, processed things available to their community that also trigger other diseases that are common amongst First Nations people. So I believe when we get to the point of studying the actual bill for the water, we need to remain focused on that, although there are other related infrastructure pieces that are all part of the whole, suggesting that this act will solve the water crisis or the infrastructure crisis due to years and decades of colonialism since contact, I think is unfair to this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ashton, and that wraps the second round we'll have today. With that, I just want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. For testimony that you've provided will be absolutely helpful for the work that we're doing. I know there was many recommendations that were brought up in your testimony today, but if there are further things that you would like to submit in writing, please do that. It'll help continue to inform our work. But with that, do I have the will of the committee to adjourn? Meeting adjourned.